In 1925, diplomats from dozens of nations gathered in Geneva and made a solemn promise. They agreed that even war had limits, that certain weapons were too savage, too indiscriminate, too cruel to ever be unleashed against another human being. They signed their names, shook hands, and returned to their capitals believing they had drawn a permanent line in the sand. 14 years later, the bloodiest war in human history began, and nearly every one of those promises shattered before the first. Year was over, the rules were real, the signatures were genuine, and none of it was enough. In 1925, diplomats from dozens of nations gathered in Geneva and made a solemn promise. They agreed that even war had limits, that certain weapons were too savage, too indiscriminate, too cruel to ever be unleashed against another human being. They signed their names, shook hands, and returned to their capitals believing they had drawn a permanent line in the sand. 14 years later, the bloodiest war in human history began, and nearly every one of those promises shattered before the first. Year was over, the rules were real, the signatures were genuine, and none of it was enough. Number 9. Expanding bullets. The Hague Declaration banned bullets designed to expand or flatten inside the human body. These rounds, known as dum-dums, were engineered to mushroom on impact, tearing through organs and shattering bone far beyond what a standard round would do. Full metal jacket ammunition became the legal standard across every major army. But soldiers don't always follow supply chains. On every front, troops were caught carving crosses into bullet tips, filing down metal jackets, even reversing rounds in their casing so the flat base struck first. The effect was identical to a banned expanding round, catastrophic internal damage with virtually no chance of survival. Snipers and resistance fighters were the most frequent offenders, arguing that they could not afford to leave an enemy alive behind them. The cost of compliance was measured in their own blood, but the cost of being caught was equally final. Soldiers found carrying modified ammunition were routinely executed on the spot, treated not as prisoners of war, but as war criminals. A single bullet in a man's pocket could mean the difference between captivity and a firing squad. Number 8. Flamethrowers against human targets. No single treaty explicitly named the flamethrower during the Second World War. It existed in a gray zone, condemned by the spirit of conventions against unnecessary suffering, yet never formally prohibited. That loophole was enough. The Americans used the M2 flamethrower to clear Japanese bunkers across the Pacific. The Germans deployed the Flammenwerfer against Soviet fortifications. Every major power carried fire onto the battlefield and insisted it was aimed at structures, not people. But a jet of burning fuel does not read legal distinctions. Soldiers caught in the stream suffered burns across their entire bodies. Many inhaled superheated air that destroyed their lungs before they could even scream, and the men who carried the flamethrower knew exactly what awaited them if they were captured. They were almost never taken prisoner. To carry fire was to forfeit mercy. What would you choose? The weapon that could save your unit, knowing it guaranteed your own destruction if things went wrong. Number 7. Chemical weapons. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 banned chemical and biological weapons in war. It was the world's direct answer to the mustard gas nightmares of the First World War. By 1939, the taboo against gas warfare was considered one of the strongest in military law. In Europe, both sides largely honored it, not out of morality, but out of fear. Each knew the other possessed massive chemical stockpiles, and retaliation would be swift and devastating. But in Asia, that deterrent? Japan deployed mustard gas, phosgene, and lewisite against Chinese forces throughout the 1930s and 1940s. Thousands of soldiers and civilians died choking on chemicals that the rest of the world had agreed should never be used again. Meanwhile, tear gas, technically banned in warfare but legal for law enforcement, was quietly used on multiple fronts to clear tunnels and enclosed positions. Armies called it a humane alternative. The men gasping and blinded inside those tunnels might have disagreed. Number 6. Incendiary bombing of civilian areas. The laws of war demanded a clear distinction between military targets and civilian populations. Deliberately attacking cities, homes, and civilian infrastructure with weapons designed to burn was a violation of principles that had existed for centuries. Both sides ignored this completely. The German Luftwaffe firebombed London and Coventry during the Blitz. The Allies responded with a fury that dwarfed anything Germany had delivered. The firebombing of Hamburg in 1943 created a firestorm that reached 800 degrees. People in basements suffocated as the inferno above consumed every trace of oxygen. An estimated 37,000 civilians died in a single week, and it only escalated from there. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 killed approximately 100,000 people in a single night, more than either atomic bomb would initially claim. The vast majority were civilians. The weapons were specifically designed to start fires that could not be extinguished. The ban on targeting civilians didn't disappear. It was simply buried beneath the logic of total war, where entire cities became acceptable targets. If you've made it this far, the weapons ahead aren't just banned, they were feared by the soldiers ordered to deploy them. Some of these entries involved decisions so extreme that the men who carried them out never spoke about it again. And the final entry on this list redefined warfare itself. Number 5, serrated bayonets. The Hague Convention's prohibition on weapons causing unnecessary suffering was broadly interpreted to include bladed weapons designed to inflict untreatable wounds. The German sawback bayonet, originally designed as a utility tool for cutting wood and rope, became one of the most despised weapons in modern warfare. When driven into a human body, the serrated teeth tore tissue on withdrawal in ways no surgeon could repair. The weapon was so hated during the First World War that captured German soldiers carrying one were often killed immediately. Germany officially withdrew them from frontline service by 1917, but when the Second World War began, old stocks resurfaced. Resistance fighters in France and Poland reported encountering serrated blades during German reprisal operations. The bayonet was officially retired. Unofficially, it kept appearing wherever the fighting was at its most brutal, and the unwritten. Penalty for carrying one remained the same. No surrender, no mercy.
Number 4. Landmines in civilian areas. Mines placed against advancing military forces were legal. Mines placed deliberately in civilian areas, near homes, schools, footpaths, and farmland, violated every principle of distinction between combatants and non-combatants. The Germans mined the countryside across North Africa, Italy, France, and Eastern Europe with systematic cruelty. The Soviets did the same during their retreats and advances. Mines were buried in church doorways, beneath the floors of abandoned homes, in wheat fields that families depended on for survival. The psychological weapon was as powerful as the explosive itself. A single mine could make an entire village afraid to walk its own roads. Over 110 million landmines were deployed during the war. Many remain in the ground today. In Egypt's western desert, mines from the 1940s continue to kill civilians more than 80 years after the armies left. The war ended. The mines did not. Number 3. Biological weapons and Unit 731. The Geneva Protocol banned biological weapons without ambiguity. Japan's Unit 731 violated that ban on an industrial scale. Operating from occupied Manchuria under General Shiro Ishii, Unit 731 conducted experiments that remain among the most horrific acts in recorded history. Thousands of prisoners were deliberately infected with plague, cholera, and anthrax. They were subjected to vivisection without anesthesia. They were frozen alive in endurance tests, and the results were weaponized. Plague-infected fleas were dropped from aircraft over Chinese cities. Contaminated water supplies spread disease through civilian populations. The estimated death toll reaches into the hundreds of thousands. But the most unsettling chapter came after the war. The United States, seeking access to the biological research data, granted immunity to Unit 731's leadership in exchange for their findings. General Ishii never stood trial. His researchers lived out their lives in anonymity. The ban had been violated on a scale almost beyond comprehension, and the perpetrators walked free. Not despite what they knew, but because of it. Justice was weighed against intelligence value, and justice lost. Number 2. Fragmentation weapons in urban combat. The principle against weapons designed to maximize unnecessary suffering extended to fragmentation devices used in enclosed spaces. In open combat, grenades and shrapnel weapons occupied a gray area. In the confined spaces of urban warfare, rooms, basements, stairwells, they became instruments of indiscriminate slaughter. During the battles of Stalingrad, Berlin, and Manila, soldiers on every side threw grenades into rooms they couldn't see into. The fragments from a single device in a confined space didn't wound. They shredded everything inside. Civilians, medics, wounded soldiers. The grenade made no distinction. The laws of war were written for open battlefields with identifiable front lines. Urban combat erased both. In Stalingrad, where the average life expectancy of a newly arrived Soviet soldier was less than 24 hours, the only question that mattered was whether you would survive the next 5 minutes. Every rule dissolved in the face of that equation. Number 1, the atomic bomb. No treaty banned nuclear weapons in 1945 because no treaty had ever imagined them. No protocol addressed them, no legal framework contained them. But every principle the laws of war had ever established, distinction between military and civilian, proportionality, the prohibition on unnecessary suffering, pointed clearly in one direction. On August 6, 1945, a single bomb killed approximately 80,000 people in Hiroshima in seconds. By the end of the year, the death toll would surpass 140,000. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. Another 70,000 dead instantly. The overwhelming majority were civilians. The weapon did not distinguish between a soldier and a child walking to school. It did not wound. It erased. And those who survived the initial blast faced radiation sickness, a form of suffering so prolonged that many survivors later said the dead were the fortunate ones. The justification has echoed for 80 years. The bombs ended the war. They prevented an invasion that could have cost millions of lives. The calculus of mass death was used to justify an act of mass death, and that argument has never been resolved. What is undeniable is that the weapon existed beyond the reach of any rule humanity had ever written. It was not banned because no one believed it was possible. And the moment it became possible, it was used, twice, in 3 days. Wars are not fought by treaties. They are fought by human beings making decisions under pressures that no conference room can replicate. Every weapon on this list was condemned by someone who never had to face the choice of using it. And every weapon was deployed by someone who believed, in that moment, that survival outweighed the rules. The laws of war have never stopped a war from being horrific. They have only given us a vocabulary to describe the horror afterward, and a framework to judge decisions made in conditions most of us will never understand. The distance between a signature on a treaty and a trigger pulled on a battlefield is not measured in miles. It is measured in the weight of a single human choice, made under a kind of pressure that bends everything, morality, law, and conscience, until something breaks. And perhaps the real question has never been whether the rules should exist. Perhaps it has always been this: what does it mean that we keep writing them, knowing every single time that they will be broken?